Hello everyone, thank you for joining us on this webinar today, where we'll be talking about how charity sector trends can inform your next board strategy. I'm Keeva Rooney, I'm a senior researcher at NCVO and I worked on the 2019 edition of the Almanac. I'm joined by my colleague Dan Francis.
Hello everyone, my name's Dan and I am our lead governance consultant here at NCVO. So my job involves leading lots of training, consultancy with charities and our work on charity governance. And my role here today, Keeva is going to talk you through the data and my job is to help relate that to boards and your next strategy. So in terms of how we're going to approach this, like with any good kind of strategy process, it's important to take a good step back and to consider the environment within which you operate. And the Almanac is a really good starting point for that. And we've picked out 4 specific areas that we're going to look at in some depth today. And that is the difference that size makes in terms of where you sit in the sector and what that means for the type of strategy and challenges that you'll be trying to address. Money, where it comes from and how it's spent in the charity sector, what the overall trends mean for your organisation. Transparency, so looking at the importance of being clear about how your organisations run and how you spend that money. And then finally, diversity, looking at the kind of skills gaps that we have as a result of absence of diversity, but also the potential perspectives that we are missing. And it's those 4 areas that we're going to focus on in some depth today.
Great, okay, thank you. So we'll just get started on talking a little bit about what the Almanac is, just to provide a bit of context. So the Almanac gives over 15 years of data on the size and scope of general charities in the UK. We look at charity finances, workforce and volunteering. We use the Charity Commission accounts as the prime data source for this. It's really important to have a distinction that in the Almanac, we're talking about general charities, which is actually different than registered charities. So we do have a more detailed description as what we mean by general charities on our website, but to think of it really simply, general charities are essentially what the man on the street would think a charity is. So we exclude universities and places of worship, independent schools, that kind of thing. So those are excluded. So just to bear in mind when looking at Almanac data that it is a slightly smaller scope than the general wider voluntary sector. Also important to note that the latest edition of the Almanac, the 2019 Almanac, actually covers the years 2016 to 2017, and that's because of where we are in our data collection process. Okay, so we'd like to get started by having a quick overview of the sector, and we'll do this by having a couple of quick fire polls. So the first poll, how many general charities are there in the UK? So just pick the option that you think is correct. So we have a few options on screen, so please just think of the one that you think accurately reflects how many general charities are in the UK. Just important to say that this is, again, just general charities. I know we're saying that word quite a lot. So just to think, it's not all registered charities. It's not the wide scope of the voluntary sector. Okay, I think we're waiting for a couple more answers before we can move on. Great, okay. So it looks like most of you have said, I'm so bad at reading out numbers, 180,890. 80,000. So actually the answer was 166,854, which is lower than you thought. Again, if you did expect the number to be higher, it could be that you're thinking of all of the registered charities or even non-registered charities, so things like co-ops and social enterprises. So it's just general charities again. But looking at this chart, you can see that the number of charities in the Almanac have remained relatively steady from the year 2000, 2001.
Okay, so the next poll is what's the total income of the sector? And you should have a number of choices there again. We're going to look in depth at the spread of this income in just a bit, because I think it can tell us an awful lot about your strategy, where you sit in terms of what your own organisation's income is. But here we're asking, what is the overall income for the voluntary sector? And we're asking that in billions of pounds. So in total, how much income does the sector receive? Give you a couple of moments to cast your votes. Okay, we've got the results in, and the majority of people there seem to think it is the 50.6 billion, which I'm pleased to say is the right answer. 50.6 billion pounds is what the sector is in receipt of, and that is up from 49.7 billion in 2015-16.
Cool. Okay, so our next poll, and our final poll of this section, is how many trustees are there in the sector? And you have a few options there. I won't read all of them out now for you, but just think about the one that you think best reflects how many trustees there are in the sector. Also important that it's just how many trustees are individual trustees as opposed to trusteeships. As I'm sure a lot of you may be sitting on multiple boards, we're not looking at how many trusteeships there are, it's just the individual trustees. I think we're just waiting for a few more of you to answer. Okay, I think we have the results in. So a lot of you said around 700,000, which again is the right answer. We clearly have a lot of people that know their stuff.
And I think what is interesting about that is that it doesn't include, as you said, the number of trusteeships, which is actually much higher. We know that there are lots of boards out there with vacancies and lots of people who sit on multiple boards, which brings that figure of the overall number of trustees down from the overall number of trusteeships.
Yeah. Right, so now we get on to the exciting bit. So this is the bit that you all come to see. So it's the kind of meat of our webinar, the sector's finances and you. So to start off, we'd really like to know a little bit more about where you sit on your organisations, what the size of your organisations are, just so we can know, tailor it a little bit to you, just because it's quite interesting. So based on the Almanac definitions, how big is your organisation? For the Almanac, for the size of organisations, we do it based on how much income they bring in as opposed to the number of employees that they have. So you have a few options there. You have super major, which are organisations that bring in more than 100 million. You have major charities, which is 10 to 100 million, large, medium, and micro and small charities as well. So be great if you could just say which ones.
And I think one of the things which, when we work with our members and speak to members, we know that these are quite big brackets in their own right, and that there's quite a bit of diversity within them, but we kind of have to settle on some kind of way of defining groups within the sector. Okay.
Great, got some in. So yeah, it seems like most of you are medium or large charities, which I think is kind of what we expected. That's quite reflective of our membership base as well. We also have a super major as well, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, somebody from micro and small organisation.
So we do have quite a broad range of people listening in, but it seems like mostly large and major, which is really interesting as we come on to our next slide. So I just want to describe this slide a little bit to you because I know it can be quite overwhelming just to see it. So you have kind of along the y-axis the different sizes of organisations. So you have, those categories that you've just seen. And then along the top you have the number of organisations, income, spending and assets as well. So the reason that it's quite interesting to see where you guys sit is because you can see that in the wider sector, the majority of charities are micro and small. In fact, actually 82% are micro and small charities. And this is really interesting when you look at the large, major and super major categories, because you can see that they actually tend to have the most income, spending and assets. So it's really kind of concentrated on that area of the chart. And then what's really, really interesting is if you're looking at just the major and super major charities, even though they make up around 0.5% of all organisations, they actually they bring in more than half of the sector's income. And I think that's like a really, really interesting finding.
Absolutely. And I always say to kind of clients and those that we train that it's really helpful to think about the kind of respective challenges which face each end of the spectrum, particularly when you're thinking about developing your board strategy and the kind of topics that you will discuss as part of that exercise. So if we think about the 82% of organisations which fall into the micro and small, I think some of the challenges which those trustees will face. Firstly, it's that blurring of responsibility between operational and strategic, between day-to-day management and the kind of long-term running of the organisation. You know, the reality of these organisations is such that trustees will spend probably a lot of time actually in the doing of the organisation as well. They will be running the soup kitchen as well as thinking about where the next set of funding for that activity is going to come from. So there's a real challenge there in terms of when does your role as a volunteer stop and when does your role as a trustee begin. Other challenges include the kind of sources of funding. We know that these groups are quite reliant on the goodwill of a small group of individuals often for funding, or local grants and the changing nature of that kind of grant money, particularly because these small organisations are often organisations which operate locally. And I think that size and ability to kind of influence is another challenge. You know, they often, I think when we speak to trustees of these organisations, feel perhaps overlooked or left out of government planning or grant giving planning because they don't necessarily have the time or resource to make themselves known. So on the lower sort of side of the end of the spectrum, where the vast majority of charities sit, these are some of the challenges their boards face. On the other end of the spectrum, you know, those boards of the super major, the larger organisations, the challenges are quite different. So, you know, how do you as a board of volunteers who come together perhaps only 6 times a year in some circumstances, how do you keep oversight and control of an organisation which operates nationally or internationally in many cases with millions or tens of millions of pounds worth of income and spending? I think it's also worth for these organisations thinking about, you know, how do you keep oversight and control of an expert executive who is doing that day-to-day management of the organisation? Who is someone who really knows their stuff and is an expert in their field in most cases. So there's a challenge there of managing an organisation at scale and the oversight and the relationship that you have with the executive. The thing on this list that I've not mentioned yet is the kind of higher levels of public scrutiny. And I think some of the challenges that we have seen in the sector over the last 3 to 5 years around fundraising practice, chief executive pay, most recently around safeguarding, it's in these larger organisations where those high profile issues that arise have perhaps the greatest resonance with the public. So it's an issue around how do we make sure that those issues are addressed properly with correct process and oversight, but also how do we communicate about the work of the organisation and respond to those challenges when they arise.
Thank you. Right, so we now have another exciting infographic. So this is a slide on income and expenditure, and just again to kind of explain what it is that you're looking at. On the top of the slide you have the income sources, so that's where the money comes from, and then towards the end you have spending, so where your money goes. And I think this is a really helpful flow chart to kind of see, to demonstrate that flow of money. So I mean, I find it useful, and hopefully you guys will find it useful. So just to talk through the income section, so that's the top section, the kind of green section there. There are 6 different income sources that we use in the Almanac. The largest income source is the public. Just really important to note that the public isn't just donations and legacies. It also includes basically any, service that the public has used that charity provides. For example, if there are like membership fees or training that the public go on that is provided by a charity, that all comes into that public definition. And also any kind of trading income as well. So if you own a charity shop, any goods bought in that charity shop will also come under the public. So just really important to kind of get that there. The second largest income comes from the government, and this isn't just UK governments. This also includes EU and international governments as well. And there are some really interesting trends when it comes to government funding. For example, I know that local government funding is kind of decreasing, and central government funding is kind of remaining the same, but it's always been quite volatile. There's always been ups and downs depending on other things that are happening in the central government. So some really interesting trends there. However, the most interesting trend, I think anyway, is that the public and the government, while being the largest source of income, aren't actually the main drivers in income increasing. So as Dan said, we've seen an income increase this year, and this is actually driven by grants and investments. So we actually are seeing the public and the government plateauing slightly. So I think this really demonstrates the importance of diversifying your income and trying to get income from different sources if possible. And NCVO actually have a really useful tool that on the website, which is called the Income Diversification Planner. We do have a link to this. We will be sending you information afterwards in the email, and we also have a tools and resources slide at the end. So please do have a look at that if you find that really useful and want to know a bit more about that. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about expenditure as well. I know that you often, as boards, have to debate the proportions of your spending and justify what you're spending your money on. So hopefully this will be really useful for you. As you can see, the sector actually spent the majority of its income. It spent 96% of its income, and most of this went towards charitable activities. And those are activities that deliver the charity's mission.
And I think, for me, this is a really useful useful graph in terms of thinking about that, which is one of the greatest debates that boards have around how much money should we spend on our charitable causes.
Yeah. So you can see that a lot of it goes towards that. And then you have grants and activities for raising funds as well. And then you have a small slither there for governance. Don't worry about that too much. It does look small, and don't worry if you think you're spending too much on governance. I don't really think there's too much spending too much on governance, but it is underestimated in the Almanac exactly how much spending goes towards governance. A lot of charities record their government costs under charitable activities, so just a reminder that governance costs are underestimated in the Almanac.
And as I was saying, one of the debates I think is around how much do we spend on our cause or mission versus how much it costs to generate those funds, or how much we then keep in reserves, or how much we spend on governance. And those kind of splits there end up being kind of fault lines of debate in boards. But I think it's not just for boards, and I think, as you were saying, it's about being able to justify externally, why these ratios are in place. Why do we spend money on governance? Why do we hold money back in reserves? What are these proportions and why they're right for us? And similarly, to compare your own income profile against those various sources of income. And it's not to say that every charity will end up following the sector overall, but it's to ask the question, is our diversity of where our money comes from reflective of those perhaps growing areas, or reflective of those areas that Keeva has just rightly kind of outlined are under pressure. And it is that point that I just made around the transparency of where money comes from and where money goes, which the Charity Commission, in its recent research, that the Trust in Charities, which I think they do every 2 years, which explores, what is the public confidence and trust in the sector. The most recent version of this found that actually confidence and trust was at its lowest level since they started monitoring. But what's really helpful about this is that they ask, well, what would drive trust in your organization? And the number one finding here is around transparency about where money goes. So this is a really live issue for the sector, and something which I think every board needs to think about is, how do we communicate both how we get our money and then how we spend it? And lots of people who know charities will say, well, you can just go onto the Charity Commission website and get that information. The reality of the situation is, though, that there are very few people, perhaps only those of us on this webinar, who would be inclined to look through the Charity Commission's kind of reports on an individual charity. And so I think we need to think perhaps a bit more innovatively about how we communicate that kind of spend.
So that brings us on to some good examples, or at least we think they're quite good examples of good transparency. And just like Dan was saying, it doesn't have to be, we report our annual reports on the Charity Commission website. It's about bringing that transparency to the public and saying, this is what we do, and justifying that to the public. So we have the first on the left-hand side, there's a tweet by Bernardo Scotland, and this is actually a pinned tweet, so every time you go on their Twitter, this is the first thing you see. And it's really disseminable, it's very easy to disseminate, very shareable. Also, it's just really a good demonstration of impact, and they update this on a monthly basis as well. And I think for most charities, this is on the right hand side is something that might be a bit more tricky for some organizations to do, but still a good idea to consider. And it's by Solar Aid, and they have a impact calculator, and it's quite similar to what a lot of charities do, and they say for every £1 that you donate, we do XYZ, whereas this is much more interactive. You can actually enter in the donation, and not only does it say how many solar lights you've been able to fund, but it also goes to the wider impact, so how many people have been reached by this, and also the environmental impact. And I think that's a really good idea if you do have the technology to be able to do that.
Both two examples, I think, of things which bring to life how people use their money in a way which doesn't mean they have to trawl through reports.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, so we are quite interested in transparency, and we'd like to hear a little bit about the kind of activity that you do. So we've got some examples here in this poll of ways in which the sector has either tried to be more transparent or kind of recommendations for how you might do that. So ensuring that board members and what they do is easily available on your website, clarity over who runs your organization, I think is really important. Show how donations go directly to charitable causes in perhaps some of the examples that we just showed. Publicly reporting your CEO salary, something which came out of the inquiry into chief executive pay, this idea that you should have transparency around the most senior members of staff in your organization and how that salary is being calculated. Make your annual report accessible on your website so that people can access it and really get under the skin of what you're doing, perhaps communicating impact in that as well. And then publicly reporting the gender pay gap data as something that's perhaps more recent and which lots of organizations are doing on a voluntary basis, even if they're not legally compelled to do so. So just some examples of activity. So we're just interested in kind of, have you tried any of these? Okay, it looks like there's a good spread of activity across them, with making information about your board available being perhaps together with making your annual report accessible on your website as being the two most common ones, the others featuring less frequently. But it's good to see that people are kind of thinking about this and trying this sort of activity.
Yeah, really good. Right, okay, so we're just kind of getting to the tail end now. So I just want to end on some information about staff and trustees and how you can use this. So we have some staff characteristics here, and these are paid staff, not volunteers. So the total number of employees in the voluntary sector was over 160,000. The voluntary sector is also more likely to be female than other sectors, and it's also more likely to have people over the age of 50 as well. It's also more likely to be white. And what's really interesting about these findings is how concentrated they are. I think it does kind of demonstrate some issues around diversity in the sector, particularly when you look at the private sector, which has things that are a bit more evenly spread. They have much more of an even spread among their characteristics. So I think that's quite interesting. And actually, we did do some recent research on the skills gap that kind of touched a little bit on why the voluntary sector could have this issue with diversity. And we found that charities value qualifications and experience more highly than other sectors. And while this is great in many ways, it may put groups who have barriers into gaining education and barriers into having that work experience at a disadvantage, namely young people, Black and minority ethnic people, disabled people, and people from lower socioeconomic groups as well. So that's just a really interesting piece of research. We published it in July of this year, or it might have been August, but you can check it on the website, and we will also have this available towards the end.
When we'll be opening up to any questions as well.
So if you do have any further questions on this research, please feel free to ask towards the end. Okay. And as Dan mentioned, the gender pay gap is also a really important issue. At NCVO, we really do encourage all organisations to publish this, regardless of if they have to legally do that or not. So the gender pay gap came about last year, was when people started publishing it. And it was all organisations with 250 or more employees that must report this. This chart shows the average amount that men get paid more than women. So for the charity sector, you can see that men get paid 7% more than women get paid. And while this is lower than other sectors, considering that the sector is mostly made up of women, you wouldn't even really expect there to be a gender pay gap. So it is the fact that this isn't at zero is still a bit of a concern. So we really do want organisations to publish this so we can get a better kind of understanding of exactly how vast the gender pay gap issue is in the voluntary sector.
And so our next slide, that's the kind of demographics and makeup of staff within the sector. And the next slide, this one, looks at the kind of demographics and makeup of boards. And I think the key issue with both of these things, for me anyway, is that what skills, experience and perspectives are we missing by not having a better diversity profile in both pools of talent? So this slide, you can see, is just some top level things, that boards are kind of predominantly male, 64%. I think that figure increases again when you look at chairs of boards, which I think is around about 70% are male. The number of trustees that are white versus the average population as a whole. The percentage that are retired, 51% retired. In fact, this is a measure across many levels, including kind of levels of qualification and average income, all of which are higher than the kind of national rates of those things. And then the average age of trustees. So you can see the kind of profile, less than 1% under the age of 35 even, and the average age of a trustee being 62. This was taken out of the Charity Commission's taken on trust research published at the end of 2017. So what's interesting about this? Well, I think that this is a kind of this kind of illustrates the challenges we have around diversity on boards and in the workforce. And as I said, the kind of questions around how do we make sure that we're not missing opportunities as a result of this. The Charity Governance Code contains a principle on diversity, which talks about how do we attract, how do we retain, but also how do we plan for that diversity on boards. And we also at NCVO have published some guidance on key kind of questions for your board to consider through the nominations and recruitment process to help make sure that when you're developing that strategy, you're looking at it from multiple angles. Okay, and it's those kind of recruitment practices which we'd just like to explore in this and our final poll, which it looks at the recruitment practice. So, have you considered reviewing time, location and frequency of meetings, paying expenses to trustees, reviewing where and how trustee vacancies are published, and monitoring and reporting on diversity, perhaps examining skills and diversity and imbalances and gaps as part of an audit. And we've got some example audits you can use. So I'll get your participation in this. Couple of moments to vote. Great, it looks like a lot of people have tried many of those, apart from perhaps the monitoring and reporting on diversity. It's interesting, that is something which the Charity Governance Code explicitly encourages for medium size and larger organisations, is to think about how do we plan for, but also how do we monitor the diversity of our boards. Mm. Okay, and just to kind of wrap up, we've covered an awful lot of ground in a very short space of time here, but I said right at the beginning of the webinar that we would explore size, we would explore money, we'd explore transparency, and we'd explore diversity, and position some questions for you in terms of what that means for your board next strategy. So the questions that I've proposed are: what challenges are we more likely to face because of our size and scale, and how do we prepare for these challenges? Where do you sit on that scale spectrum, and what kind of challenges do you need to prepare for in your strategy? How does our income and spending match the sector overall, looking at that profile? And are we both comfortable with this in terms of sustainability, but also comfortable in terms of justifying our ratios and being able to be transparent about them? Then transparency itself, thinking about the range of ideas around communicating both your impact and how you're run and how you spend your money. And finally, diversity. Could our charity benefit from increased diversity of skills, experience and background? What are we missing? And crucially, what perspectives are we missing that could help to shape our strategy? What do we need to do to attract and also retain that talent? So 4 quite kind of tangible questions which I'd encourage you to take away and discuss with your boards following this webinar.
Great, thank you. So we're just reaching towards the end of the webinar before we go on to questions, but I just wanted to flag a few useful resources and tools. So I won't go through this too much now. We will be sending out an email after this webinar which basically has all this information. We do have the Almanac website there. We have a practical support publications page as well. And we have a few things from Know How Nonprofit on governance guidance. And we also have the Charity Governance Code. Yeah, and those Know How resources are where you can access any of the stuff that we've talked about in terms of kind of board diversity tools, or anytime the Charity Governance Code says you should have A or you should think about A, we've looked to develop a tool on that. Yeah. And then we also have some further support as well. So we have our NCVO consultancy team, and we have training, and there's also the annual trustee conference as well, which has passed. We're now looking for next year's. So yeah, just to flag a few further support things there. Great, I think we're now ready for some questions. So if you do have any questions, please do type them in and we'll do our best to answer them for you.
Okay, we have one here. I think this is one for you, Keeva,
Okay.
on what are the trends in in government funding?
In government funding, okay. So I did go into this a little bit in the presentation, but essentially we know that government funding in general is plateauing, even though it's the second largest income source. If we're looking at local government and central government funding, I mean, we do know that smaller charities tend to rely more on local government funding, and we know that this has reduced. So particularly for smaller charities, it's really important to look at any other funding options there. I know it's probably easier said than done, so definitely have a look at that income diversification tool for any tips. And then in terms of central government funding, like I mentioned, it really is dependent on what the current political climate is. So it is much more volatile. It's generally kind of steady-ish, but there's definitely periods of ups and downs, and that is quite consistent. For some more information, I definitely would check out the website if there's anything in particular that you want to know, but I think the kind of main kind of key takeaways from this would be that there is government funding available, but it is plateauing a bit, and
Sure.
with Brexit on the, or possibly having Brexit on the horizon, we're not sure where that could go.
Okay. Okay, we've got another question coming in at the moment, which is just what information and guidance is there for free remuneration on remuneration packages for staff? Oh, hang on. Oh, fair remuneration packages for staff. Okay. I think that's an interesting question. I think the key thing that I would probably signpost to there is the inquiry into senior staff pay in the sector. And the reason I say that that's relevant to all staff and organisations is the idea that actually it looked at a cross-sector profile, and it also asked, it suggested having ratios between the highest and lowest paid member of staff. So I think I would kind of suggest that you take a look at that, which I think was published in 2016, the inquiry into senior staff pay. Okay, we have another one here on what are a good level of reserves.
I think that's probably best for you to
probably another one for me. So in terms of a good level of reserves, I think that what we typically recommend is that it has to be right for your organisation. And it's one of the reasons why, as planning your kind of strategy and your next phase of your organisation's development, you would consider that. I think in general terms, 3 to 6 months operating costs is kind of what is recommended, but it is always context specific. And I know of organisations who've chosen to move to reduce their reserves level because they feel pretty secure in their income funding streams and can justify spending some of those reserves. And I know other organisations who know that they're entering into a particularly volatile period in terms of their kind of funding profile, and so have, as a result, sought to increase their reserves, at least in the short term. So what I say to every organisation is it really has to be based on you for that one. Okay, should we take another question?
Yeah, I was looking at this one. So we've got one, how can we involve those under 35 where we know commitment and free voluntary service doesn't always appear high on the agenda? Again, probably best for you to tackle, but if I just kind of start off, as someone who is under 35, I think it's about organisations actually coming to you and saying, have you ever thought about becoming a trustee? I know that we have the Time Well Spent report, which talks about volunteering much more widely, but does kind of go into this. And they mention that with young people, a key driver is, increased employability and, increasing your skills and that kind of thing. And while that is a good way to get younger people involved, in terms of keeping them on, it's really about them being passionate about what the cause is, and also being asked to volunteer is actually the key way that people get involved. So I think actually going out and asking people that, or maybe even going to service users that are younger and saying, have you thought about sitting on our board? Even just being asked that question is a really good way to start.
I absolutely think I agree with that. I don't think there's any kind of shortage of demand in terms of young people who want to sit on boards, and I think there's good evidence to suggest that young people do volunteer, but it's just the idea of being on a board that is the opportunity that doesn't feel quite like a good fit. And then sometimes when I look at job descriptions for trustees, I'm not at all surprised that is the case. When it says a prerequisite of 10 years board experience, or you have to have been a senior manager, and you just think you're naturally excluding a whole group of people here. So I think it's about thinking about what skills, experience, and insight you really want at your board level, and constructing your recruitment packs around that, as well as being proactive in the way that you've described.
Yeah, I definitely think that's really interesting. I know that when we had our trustee conference recently, and that did come up about the idea that of valuing lived experience as well as work experience. So I think that's really important and valid to think about the actual skills and experience wanted as opposed to work experience qualifications.
And there's another question here around my charity's about to interview new trustees from BME backgrounds to only shortlists. Do you have any experience of this, tips or kind of pitfalls in terms of trying to diversify?
I think when it comes to, if we're talking about, if I start at the beginning of, you want to have more BAME people on your board, where do I start? The first thing you need to think about is, how am I advertising these vacancies and where am I advertising these vacancies? And that is a good start. It seems like you have already done that stage, you're about to interview them. So I guess when it comes to interviewing, just making sure that there are all sorts of options available. And I actually think this isn't even just about BME only vacancies. It is just, I think, just general good practice if you want to increase any diversity, having different options about times of day, or even like Skype or telephone interviews. I think just being more open-minded about the interview process is a good place to start.
Actually, our guidance on this is quite well formed. So I would kind of encourage you, perhaps before you start the process, to take a look at our know-how site and look at trustee diversity on there. We've got that kind of set of questions, because I think one of the big things, for me at least, and I've been involved in lots of trustee recruitment, is it's not just about getting people to the boardroom and getting people to sit on boards, but it's also often about kind of what makes it a rewarding experience for people to stay. And I think sometimes, too often, we kind of construct boards around kind of the majority of board members. We have, as Keeva's just been saying, with meetings in the middle of the day at inaccessible locations. We use exclusive language. And this isn't about any particular diversity type, but actually, if we were to think a bit more kind of existentially about the way we hold meetings, then I think that can really help. Okay, I'm going to take a few more questions. There's one here on, from your figures, the average number of trustees per charity appears to be only 4. This seems to be very low. Can you comment? I think
that might be, so I think that's from our previous slides when we were looking at the average number of trustees, instead of looking at the average number of trusteeships. I think that might be it, and that could be why it appears to be low.
Yeah.
So it could be that you're looking at the number of trustees. Again, there are people that sit on multiple boards, so the actual number of trusteeships is higher, but trustees are low, if that kind of makes sense.
Well, yeah, what's interesting, I mean, in terms of for an individual charity, the charity governance code is quite clear on what's good practice, and that it should be a board between 5 and 12. And I think that is right when you can kind of consider the importance of having diversity of perspective and different angles and views represented on your board, that actually you need a group big enough to have your various areas covered, but not so big that you can't make those kind of collective decisions. Okay, final question we'll take then is, where can we find a charity sector pest analysis? I mean, my recommendation on that, and I don't know if you've got anything else, would be the really best starting point would be some of the Almanac data around the kind of economic stuff. And I think a number of kind of the research reports which are linked in slides will help you to develop that for yourself. And I think it's helpful to kind of, it's obviously helpful to look at the sector-wide information, but you have to relate it to your origin and context.
No, I completely agree. Don't think I have too much else to add to that. I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Okay, unfortunately, I think that's us out of time, but thank you very much for listening to today's webinar. We'll be sharing the slides after today's session, and it goes without saying that we're answer any questions of today's content by way of follow-up. So thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thank you.